for coming and for being a part of this and supporting Dylan. So today he's going to present his master's thesis defense. There will be a presentation for everyone. There will be an open period for questions from the general audience. And then we will have a closed session where we'll ask everyone to leave. And the faculty on the committee will continue to berate Dylan with questions and see what he's made of. And then we'll kick him out and we'll decide his fate. And then we will let him know what that is. So if you would like to get food, it has arrived, so help yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Dylan so we can get started. And that is the order of events for today. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Let us jump right into this thesis defense entitled Time-Dependent Crack Growth Mechanisms in Alloy 617 at 800C for Next Generation Nuclear Applications. This is the outline that you've seen many times before, so I'm not going to dwell on it. We're going to jump right into motivation and background. Why do we need next generation nuclear power? Why build more nuclear power plants? This diagram says it all. Look at the big red box. 8.42 quads, quadrillion BTUs of electricity generation comes from nuclear. That capsizes solar, hydro, wind, and geothermal combined. So this is our carbon-free energy source in the United States at present. Doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. I mean, wind and solar may catch up over the course of the next couple decades, but it is a part of the solution. But it's not just a part of the solution for electricity generation. We have to look at these pink boxes. Look at all this other area of the economy that could be useful for nuclear, and we apply our brains and we think, well, where can we actually use it? Well, not residential, not in your backyard, right? Not downtown, not in the commercial sector, not in a car or a train, but industrial. That's where we can use next generation nuclear power, and this is how we're going to use it. That's the next generation nuclear plant, and it's a hot core. It's hotter than ever before. It's 800 or 900 degrees Celsius as compared to 300, 400 degrees Celsius, the current reactors that are now being phased out. That's how hot they are. And you transfer the heat from that nuclear reactor in it's called a high temperature gas-cooled reactor, in a helium loop that goes through this thing called the intermediate heat exchanger and then out towards industrial production and electricity production, and then hydrogen production if we ever find a way to make a container that can hold hydrogen. But that's another material science problem that somebody else is working on, not the point of this project. Industrial production, chemical processes, metallurgical processes, a whole nother foundation for infrastructure in America if we get this right and we start building lots of these plants. So my problem is how to make the material in the intermediate heat exchanger withstand 60-year design life. How do we do that? And what are the problems we face in trying to do that? Well, that intermediate heat exchanger is going to be one of two things. It's going to be shell and tube or a compact plate, which seems nicer because it has this animation, but it's actually less technologically developed. We're probably going to first go with the shell and tube heat exchanger where there's hundreds, if not thousands, of tubes, 2 millimeters thick and 2 centimeters in diameter, of alloy 617 with high temperature helium passing through them. This is what they look like in real life. Shell and tube is really big, compact, it's more compact, but it's a few decades away from being implemented at these temperatures anyway. So we'll probably go with shell and tube first. And what's the problem with shell and tube or plate? It's this idea of creep and fatigue synergy, promoting crack growth mechanisms in your material. Creep is time-dependent deformation enabling crack growth at high temperatures. So we imagine if we have a bar of steel and we pull on it, it's 800 degrees. Over time, even though you're pulling below the yield stress, it's going to start to fall apart. And that's what creep is. It's time-dependent deformation. When you have cyclic damage, which in the case of a nuclear plant, we have to start thinking about how the plant is going to be ramping up and ramping down its energy production day in, day out for 60 years. And the worst case scenario that we tend to think about actually is one in which we've got to load follow the renewables. So if the sun goes down at night, the wind stops blowing, well, we have to ramp up energy production to compensate and supply that energy to the grid. And so that's the worst case scenario, barring any other storage technologies like batteries getting a lot better or other technologies for storing energy. And that puts you in a bad situation if creep and fatigue do in fact interact. Creep is time-dependent deformation that occurs above 40% of the melting temperature of the alloy, right in 800C, we're operating 60 or 70% of the melting temperature of this alloy. And to understand this problem of crack growth at this temperature, you have to have a little bit of background in fracture mechanics. I'm not going to go deeply into the math, but it suffices to say that you have to pick the right parameter for the job. Because if you don't pick the right parameter, then your crack tip conditions are not going to be characterized appropriately. And pictures are worth thousands of words. So I will get to the pictures in just one moment and just say that stress intensity factor K is really easy to measure. So we usually measure that. It's simple. And these ones are harder to get at. So not many people measure them. And so we'll see how that goes a little bit further in the presentation. This gives us a feel for where K actually applies. So at this crack tip, there's a plastic zone at the very tip where the material has yielded, it's past its yield stress. You got that little circle there. Outside of that, encompassing that, is a creep zone where creep strains are dominating. And then outside of that, that's where K applies. That's where it's operating in the linear elastic region of the material on a traditional stress strain curve. And so the thing is, if the plastic zone and the creep zone are too big, then K doesn't work. It's not going to apply. This is another view of the creep zone, and because it gets a little bit complicated. Creep is time dependent, and if you give the material enough time, the creep zone just grows and grows and grows and encompasses the entire uncracked ligament of whatever you're dealing with. So there's a concept called the transition time, which we were able to measure in this work, that happens between small scale and extensive creep. What is the time that it takes to have a small creep zone turn into a big creep zone? And we measured that as about 80 seconds, give or take. And that will become important later. A few more comments on creep and background, and then we can jump into the actual methods of this thing. The thing about Alloy 617 is it does not exhibit a classical creep curve where you have this steady state secondary regime that we modeled with the power law. We make some assumptions that we can model creep with a power law based on the minimum creep rate where the star is. We just draw a tangent line and we take a power law from that, and it works fine. Trust me on that, it's great. One other thing that we wanted to take into account about creep in this alloy is that some research by Lilo and Wright over at Idaho National Labs, that at this temperature, the actual mechanism that gives you the onset to increase strain rates and catastrophic failure and rupture is this thing called low energy dislocation substructures, something that we can't see unless we look at it with transmission electron microscopy. So that's the picture that we're showing, that dislocations will form into these nice little substructures, and then the mobile dislocations that are left over have a longer mean free path, which generates high strain rates that give you the onset of the tertiary regime. One more thing in the background here to say that's important: stress relaxation. If you have a slower loading rate on your sample and you're pulling on it slower, there's more opportunity, again, time dependence, right? There's more opportunity for stresses that are forming at the crack tip, that are concentrated at the crack tip, to relax based on the creep strains that are active at the crack tip. So if you're pulling on it slowly enough, you're going to get stress relaxation at your crack tip and lower crack growth rates as a result, and we'll see that in our results going forward. But first, the methods. How did we actually do this stuff? That's composition of alloy 617. It's got 13 alloying elements in it, plus I think there's some phosphorus in there. This is a microstructure done by some folks at INL. This is the orientation of our samples. This is a schematic of what our samples look like. Compact tension samples where you put pins in these holes and then you pull it apart with a clevis system, which I'll show you on the next slide here. This is a sample when it's about ready to go into the machine. I've spot welded 5 thermocouples on it, mostly redundant because at least a couple of them are going to fall off by the time you get in the machine, the shell knows. So those are thermocouples. Then we have our electropotential drop system for measuring crack growth, and the whole point there is that we're driving current through the sample, and as the crack opens, the current has less of a path to travel through, so the sample's acting as a variable resistor. And so less path to travel through means resistance goes up, and the voltage that we measure across the crack goes up, and then we correlate that to the crack length. So that's how we're actually measuring these things at these high temperatures. And you get the crack length out of this whole thing from the voltage, and then you take the derivative of that, you get the crack growth rate, which is ultimately what we're after. This is what the setup looks like. It's a induction coil surrounding Inconel 718 clevises, which that's a trick in and of itself, is how do you get the clevises not to deform, but your samples to break. You know, you want the right thing to break. You don't want your setup to break. The induction coil went through several iterations of how that thing looks. So there's another picture next that has a different coil. And then cooling coils to keep the rest of the Instron or the MTS test machines cold. This is, like I said, another coil, and it's modified so that we could stick a high temperature extensometer into it and measure something that's very important for the whole time-dependent aspect of this problem. If you don't measure this, then you're like missing this whole aspect that otherwise you can kind of sweep under the rug by just gathering the K data, the stress intensity data. And that aspect is the force line displacement, this little line here, like how far apart does the sample get during the test, and how fast is that happening? And normally you have a clip gauge attached at the force line, but that's kind of impossible with all the wires we got going on in this thing, how tight things are in there. So what we did was we stuck the extensometer in there and measured the clevis displacement, and that worked pretty well. Okay, these are the waveforms that we use. I'm not going to dwell on the overload tests that we went through. That's kind of a whole thing in itself. I'll show some results from it, but the main idea here is not about the cell range. It's about the Pmax and Pmin values. We tested everything at a load ratio of 0.5, and we had a 5 hertz waveform, a 0.33 hertz waveform, a 0.05 hertz waveform, and a 0.05 hertz trapezoidal waveform at this hold time. And our load ratio was 0.5, meaning that Pmax goes up here, and then when it goes back down to its minimum, that's half of Pmax. Other studies might go down to 0.1 of Pmax, and we'll see some comparisons later in the presentation. The results, the best part. Look at those results. This doesn't do anything for you, but it does something for my ego. So that's great. And so there's a lot of dots that come out of the results. And this is a traditional domain for viewing this data in crack growth rate per cycle versus the stress intensity range. And I'm not going to cycle back through because I've got to make this presentation move as fast as we can. But the stress intensity range is derived from Pmax and Pmin. Pmax, when you get the geometry of your sample, translates into a Kmax. And Pmin, the load minimum that you're applying in your waveform, and go up and down, translates to a Kmin. And so Kmax minus Kmin is delta K. And this is traditionally how you're going to view the T crack growth data. And what do we see when we view it this way? We see our 5 hertz, our 0.33 hertz, our 0.05 hertz, and our hold time. And what we immediately notice is that there's a pretty robust response at lower delta K values. Like the crack growth rates are not increasing very much, and that's good news for next generation nuclear reactors. At lower temperatures, in fact, at 650, and these studies have been done, and they're out there by Isu, I believe is his name. When you lower the frequency sufficiently, you actually get orders of magnitude increases here on the crack growth rates on the low delta K range. And so that's important. And why is it happening? Because stress relaxation is happening in these slow waveforms. Okay, it's hot enough to where stress is relaxing at the crack tip, and crack growth rates are actually lowered because of that. That's the working theory that we've got anyway. What else do we see from this plot? We see that at a certain point, maybe call it delta K, so these are log-log plots, so maybe call it delta K is 11.5 megapascal root meters, which is a strange unit, don't get hung up on it, no big deal. Maybe there's a breakaway effect, and the slow loading waveforms really start to have higher crack growth rates. I mean, if we look at this in a couple different ways, we start to get a different feel for the data. And so I'm going to show you another few graphs, and then we're going to show a bunch of samples. This graph is in the time domain. Crack growth rate per time versus K max. So we're no longer looking at delta K, K max minus K min. We're looking at just the K max applied to the sample in that loading waveform. dAdt is the crack growth rate per time. And what this view allows us to do is input these little red bars here, which were the sustained load crack growth tests that we did. Really only one successful one, where we just pull on the thing and see how hard we have to pull on it to get it to break. Okay? And the thing is, this tells us something really, really important, that the sustained load crack growth rate overlaps with the low frequency. And what does that mean? It means there's no creep fatigue interaction. Pure creep crack growth, which you could say more the proper nomenclature is the pure sustained load crack growth. It overlaps with this fatigue waveform that we've got, either the whole time or the triangle waveform. So that's important. That's an important finding. This is, I'm not going to say too much about this graph other than, oh, what's that? It's C star. It's a time-dependent parameter, and it's difficult to gather. And all that extensometer feeding through the induction coil, that's what allows us to get this, which allows us to get the transition time of the material, which tells us something important about the use of K in general. Okay, and all I want to point out here is that from some studies that were done in the 90s, our data coheres decently with their power law that they got out of it. Finally, some pictures. Let's look at these things. These are the fracture surfaces, and I should clarify. Up at the top, we've got the delta K experienced by the sample. These are increasing delta K tests. So the delta K experienced by the sample when the test first started is lower than when it ends. Okay? And the crack growth is happening from left to right on everything that we're looking at. That's the preferred orientation in the western world. So, 5 hertz. What do we see? By the end of the experiment, we see there's a little bit of surface roughness going on in both these samples. But for the most part, very smooth transgranular crack growth. Same kind of thing for 0.33 hertz. Again, we're slowing the frequency down. We're giving time-dependent mechanisms maybe a little bit more chance to activate. And we see maybe a little bit more roughness at maybe a little bit lower delta K values. Do you see what I see? There's another 0.33 hertz, another surface roughness. Then when we slow it down even more to 0.05 hertz, we see even more surface roughness. We see something even different. And this sample was tested near the threshold, so it's pretty smooth. Like there was very little crack growth happening here. And it's interesting to contrast these three in particular because these are different sample geometries. And this sample being a little bit thicker than these two samples. So the thinner samples seem to have even more roughness at lower delta K values. And that's interesting in of itself. And we have what appears to be a thickness effect going on with our samples. And we've got to grapple with that and what it means for the study of fraction mechanics at these high temperatures. Not a main point of our study, just something that is interesting that is going to be relevant for future work. Then if we go a little bit higher, see we're only at, well, you know, right now we're a little bit below where the low frequencies start to break away on the first plot that I showed you. You guys remember that? Where it starts to break away, it gets really fast, it's really bad. We're below it. And so if we go a little bit above it, it's 11.8 and then 15, with totally different character. That's what happens when you break away, is you get this, when we look at it in a different way from the profile side, what looks like a void coalescence mechanism that is time dependent. Okay? So this is the 0.05 hertz, the green dots on the plot. When we start looking at the hold time, it's kind of a whole different picture. But it's much the same as the green dots. As you saw, the green dots overlap with the orange dots. Much the same crack growth rates, and so much the same mechanisms are present. One takeaway is that hold time and that ramp rate didn't apparently change crack growth rates that much. But one thing, I'm going to gloss over this in the interest of time, I suppose. But one thing about sample 61724 is that it was kind of shady experimental conditions. Okay, we had it at 800C. We had 2 millimeters of pretty rough crack growth, and then the whole thing, a limit tripped. It went down to 500 degrees Celsius. We held it there for 8 hours with no load because I wasn't here. I came in the morning and found it, and then turned, heated it back up, turned it back on, and then it all of a sudden tripped to a much, look at this thing, voids and roughness. So it tripped this other mechanism, but the takeaway is that even though this is kind of below our threshold where it breaks away, we saw this kind of different fracture surface, but we don't see higher crack growth rates than the green dots or even the blue or the purple ones. So we'll look at the graphs again and try to reiterate that point, but if we look at 2 other hold time samples, we get a better idea of the transition. We'll look at this in a couple different ways. Again, hold time samples aligned with their stress intensities, you get all the way up to 17.6. And I know that's a little bit darkened out because of the compliance of the sample. This is actually, this is the edge of the sample. And we had a better close-up of it. What you'd see is, maybe something that I'll draw on the board later, is that the sample's very compliant and getting very thin as the crack is opening. And what do we really see here? That there's a mechanistic shift right around 12 megapascal root meters equals delta K. Same mechanistic shift happens, maybe 12, 13. There's a good enough agreement with these 2 samples to say that's where the transition happens, that's where crack growth rates increase. Finally, as far as fracture surfaces go, and then we'll look at a different view, sustained loading, just pulling on the samples, gives us this. And now the parameter we have to use is not a delta, it's just K max that we're thinking about. So the corresponding delta K is 11.5 or 12. Okay, so with a load ratio of 0.5, we multiply by 2, and the K max for all the samples we already looked at, the K max of the transition is around 23 or maybe 24. And that's what we see here is when we finally get sustained load crack growth, we're able to start it around 23. And you get that immediate time-dependent mechanism of void growth. And we'll see exactly what that looks like from the side, because right now we've been looking at, when we break these things open and look at the fracture surface, we've been looking at that view. Now we're going to look at when we slice all the samples down the center with electrodischarge machining and polish them real nice, and look at them from the side with a couple different devices. And that's, so I'm not going to dwell on this. There's too much going on here to dwell on. But there's just a couple things that I want to point out, since it looks like I'm talking really fast, I'm going to have the time. Which is that what we're trying to do here is measure oxygen at the crack tip, okay, and specifically oxides that are forming at the crack tip, and see if that has some impact on the crack growth rates, or at least see what happens throughout all these tests and see the relative concentrations of oxygen in all these crack tips. And what do we see? We see that when there's less time for oxides to develop, we have lower little blue peaks of oxygen concentration. So this is oxygen concentration and line scan distance, since the plots are crammed in here to let you see them all. And so the 5 hertz, lower oxygen concentration, 0.33 hertz, a little bit larger, certainly gets larger as delta K goes up. This delta K is low, higher, highest, low, higher, highest. And when you slow it down to 0.05 hertz, something interesting actually happens that is worth talking about for just a second, which is that these 2 pictures here are the low delta K tests of a 0.05 hertz waveform, and when we chop it and look at the profile, what we see is a protective oxide forming behind the sharp crack tip. So there's a really sharp crack tip here, and then there's this oxide that we detect. So there's no oxygen here, and then there's a lot of oxygen here. And same thing with this one. And when you go to higher stress intensities, that protection will doodle bop, for lack of a better word, that little guy, he goes away. The whole thing is oxidized. And it's, this is informative for the case of an impure helium environment, because in impure helium, you're going to have a much lower concentration, partial pressure of oxygen. And that's how this is going to be applied in the next generation nuclear reactor, right? And in that environment, you're not going to have a protective oxide forming. So we know that it doesn't matter for higher stress intensities because oxygen's oxygen's going to fill up the entire crack tip, but for lower stress intensities, we might need to do some more tests in impure helium to figure out what the effects are of removing the protective oxide, but still having maybe enough partial pressure of oxygen to do some dynamic embrittlement mechanisms, because that stuff can mess you up. So this is the whole time data for the same thing that we're looking at with oxygen. If you have a hold time, you obviously get bigger peaks, even more oxygen. But not only that, it's important to point out the kind of morphology of the crack tips changes here. And you can start to get these like networks of little micro cracks. And when you polish these down, you see that these are actually, they're voids underneath. Okay, so that's why we know it's a void growth mechanism. And this plot will make it even clearer in a second. And the next one after this. Got to contrast these two. As we look at all of these, check it out. The force line displacement is different, right? They open to different, that one's a little bit more open than this one. You know what I mean? See that? So this next plot is going to be showing the fracture surfaces of these two samples again, where we had large force line displacements, and this is where we stuck the extensometer in, and we got the force line displacement rate. And it becomes just very clear that a time-dependent mechanism, that's not like it wasn't clear already, okay, but it becomes extremely clear that the time-dependent mechanism is at play right at the transition in our fracture surface behavior. At the end of 27G, the orange line, we get this spike up, and right near the beginning of 32G, the force line displacement goes way up. You get this hockey stick, plot. And so what does that tell us? It's time dependence. And what does that mean? It means that K might not work in that regime. It might not. There might be so much creep, such a big creep zone that the elastic K field really cannot describe what's going on. Okay. So this might be the most explanatory of them all. These are etched micrographs under an optical microscope of 0.05 Hertz triangle wave samples, stopped at 4 different stress intensities on our classical plot, the very first plot that we looked at for fatigue crack growth, per cycle versus delta K. And so the first one down here, it's going straight through the sample. It's transgranular crack growth. For a little bit higher stress intensity, you start to see these little excursions coming off. And maybe if you use your imagination, hey, is that a void forming? I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard to say with the polishing techniques that we have, that if we're using mechanical polishing, or we like pulling stuff out of the sample when we polish it, we'd be using electro polishing. Might be something for future work. Next stress intensity up, right at the threshold. We were so lucky. It's total luck, guys. It's a happy accident that the machine stopped, the thing failed. It didn't really fail, it stopped. Or right at the threshold, and we see this amazing little profile. That right at the threshold, everything branches. And this is how the transition in behavior happens, the transition towards time dependence. That voids are forming. If you polish this thing down, you see a void there, you see a void here, you see a void here. Voids are forming, and the crack branches into all the voids. And then what happens? This is the highest stress intensity where the crack growth rate has broken away. And so we see in this sample where the transition happened, where it branched off in these sharp little triangular cracks, and then one of those paths got dominated with void growth, and it chooses that one path. And that's what's happening. It's clear as day. I'm not going to say too much about the overload experiments we did, other than it relates to stress relaxation, and these are some of the results. And so what were we really doing here? We were cycling at 0.33 hertz, and then we add a higher stress intensity cycle for 20 cycles or so. And then we go back to normal cycling, and we see if the crack growth rate was retarded or not. Was it slowed down? Is it decelerating after the overload period, like you would see based on classical theory about overloads? And the interesting thing that we find is that this overload was applied below this threshold that we keep talking about, this threshold of time dependence. And on the fracture surface, you see those markings. You can tell where the overload happened. And you can tell that the overload had some effect when you do this kind of linear intercept method. You can see that there's a slower crack growth rate for the first few cycles. But then when you go to a higher stress intensity, and you apply an overload, well, first you get the branching behavior. You can see it's branching into the fracture surface. If you were to use your imagination and look at it from the side, you'd see that branching, right? And then you see that at higher stress intensities, is there any discernible retardation effect? I don't think so. These lines pretty much overlap, and it would appear that at those stress intensities, stress relaxation is so high that there's no retardation effect at all. So that's enough on overloads. Let's look at a messy plot and make it less messy so that we can understand together and understand the literature data and how the data that I collected tries to relate to the literature data. So let's take all literature data away except for one dot and talk about it. This is all our data, and again, going back to a plot we looked at before, DADT versus Kmax. And we're adding this red square, which is Ma et al.'s sustained load crack growth test. And what we see is that it's above our little red bars. So their crack growth rate compared to ours is a little bit faster. And we have to have an explanation for that. And our working explanation is that their samples are thicker. And why would that matter? Well, void growth is the time-dependent mechanism that we're talking about. Then a state of plane strain, which you're going to get in a thicker sample, would give you more void growth. And what does that even mean? Plane strain promotes a triaxial stress state at the crack tip, and the analogy that you can use is of blowing up a balloon. So if you pull on two sides of a balloon, it does not inflate. That's like plane stress. Okay, so that's a thin sample. You don't no voids. How do you inflate that balloon pulling on two sides of it? If you have a triaxial stress state, you're pulling on all sides of the balloon at once. And you get void growth. That's a thick sample. So that's why we think that they're, how do you explain this gap? It's about twice as fast, I guess. But on a log plot, it's actually pretty close. Okay, so let's add another couple dots. What else did exist in the literature, and how can we compare it to what we found? And what does it mean? Ma et al. Also did a 0.33 hertz sample, and they did it at a lower load ratio. So if you remember when we looked at the load waveforms, our load ratio is 0.5, and theirs is 0.1. So we went to 50% of the maximum load for each of our fatigue cycles. They went to 10%, and you expect that to result in higher crack growth rates. This is how it works. So we understand why that's higher. And then they did a hold time test at 60 seconds. 60-second hold time test with R equals 0.1. And now we start to see something kind of disconcerting. What does this actually mean? The fact that their hold time is higher than their sustained load crack growth, whereas our hold times are aligned pretty well with our sustained load crack growth. What's the deal? Why is it higher? And further, why is this dot even higher? What's going on? What could possibly explain this? The 120 second. Well, the thing is, when you look at the data, and you look at the way they perform the test, there would appear to be a strong history effect in the way that this is performed, because these three data points, blue, red, and gray, all came off the same sample. So they collected 0.33 hertz, they grew the crack for a couple millimeters, and then they changed from 0.33 hertz to a 60-second hold time, grew it for 2 more millimeters, and then they changed it to 120-second hold time and grew it for the end of the test. Okay, and so why is that important? Because these hold times are very close to the transition time for the material. Yeah, bomb drop, mic drop. That's the thing. Transition time measured at 80 seconds. If you're, our hold time is on the verge of being reasonable for K. Okay, it's on the verge because it's like 4 times less. 20 seconds is 4 times less than 80 seconds. Ideally, you want your hold time to be an order of magnitude less if you're really going to use K rigorously by the standard. But ours is on the edge of applicability. Theirs is definitely outside it. And what does that mean? It means for a long hold time, when you test that 0.33 hertz and then you test that 60-second hold time, you're going to get extensive creep in the uncracked ligament. It's going to be defined by a creep zone, and you're going to get those things, the low energy dislocation substructures that we talked about earlier, forming, providing this hidden damaging mechanism that when you go and you apply the 120-second waveform, you're acting on material that's already ready to break, right? So of course you're going to get this little gray box up here. And why am I so vehement about this? Why? Because other data shows us something different in the literature. Benz and Wright, they've got some data to compare to, and it's very fun to look at. 0.5 hertz, I labeled it blue because 0.5 is pretty close to 0.33, so give me that. And it's a 0.05 load ratio, so it makes sense that this is higher, right? Because it's a lower load ratio. And then they also did some hold time tests, and their hold time tests show up here. Okay, that's their 10-second for lower load ratio. And then when they increase their hold time, 60 seconds, it's lower. Why would it be lower? What is that all about? And then the longest one, 300-second hold time, and they have even lower. So it's the exact opposite of what Mom measured. And why is it the opposite? Has anybody got it? Anybody got it? The answer from yeah? I'd stare at this for quite a while before I think I get that this is their data is collected right below the transition. Right below the transition to time dependence. So of course you're not going to see faster crack growth rates with time, okay? Because the time-dependent crack growth mechanisms are not active. But they did apply their tests in exactly the same way Ma did to the same sample. So because it's near the transition on this next plot, because it's near the transition, their gray X, it still is higher on the cyclic y-axis, crack growth rate per cycle, looking versus Kmax. This is the last plot I want to look at, and to try to draw some conclusions from it about what this means for next generation nuclear power, because that's the whole point of the project, right? To my eye, it looks like Rudig's data for 5 hertz at a lower load ratio, less than 0.1, and Benz and Wright's data for lower load ratios for some faster, slightly faster and slightly slower triangular waves. All they're doing is they're shifting upward. And the lower load ratio shifts the whole thing upward. And that's important. It's important that it doesn't change it in some other way. And what we see from the limited data that we've gathered or being able to compare to in the literature is that yes, these last data points, the gray ones, and labeled them gray for a reason, might not be so reliable. But what is reliable is that K max of 23 or so, or if you want to look at delta K, 11.5, that's where the transition happens, even at a load ratio of 0.1. So we've uncovered this persistent trend in crack growth rates that allows designers of next generation nuclear plants and the intermediate heat exchanger in general to design, to use these power laws that come out of this data to understand how fast is the crack going to grow per cycle, per day, per week, as we're loading, as we're increasing the power production, increasing. We can start to get estimates, and as long as we keep it below this threshold for time dependence, we're going to get the right mechanism that's going to allow the mechanism, the IHX, to last for a long time. So this is beautiful. It's coming in just, I must have talked really fast, and it must have been just, maybe you guys, I'm sure, I don't know. These are my conclusions. This is what I'm going to try to conclude. That due to its viscoplastic response, alloy 617 displays robust resistance to changes in frequency in air up to delta K equals 11.5 for load ratio of 0.5. This robust behavior appears to persist at R equals 0.1 for a similar mix of data reported in the literature. The sustained load crack growth threshold, this K threshold that we measured, is bounded because we did 3 creep tests, some of them at lower loads, lower pulling on it with less of a load, and the crack doesn't grow. Okay, so there's a threshold where the crack grows when you just pull on it. You have to pull on it just so hard, somewhere between 18.3 and 23 megapascal root meters in terms of K. The transition between transgranular cracking and void coalescence in alloy 617 and 800 has been mapped in air, and potential mechanisms have been discussed. Oxygen activity of the crack tip increases with hold times or sustained loads, and the protective oxide layer seen in low stress intensity 0.05 hertz triangular wave samples disappears at higher stress intensities. It's a simple observation, but it will be important for future work. And what appears to be a thickness effect between data produced here and that reported by Ma et al. Actually, and by Rudig, Requires systematic study for the purpose of understanding the behavior of thin sections. We have to remember that the tubes that were actually, or the plates, depending on the manifestation of this design, are like 2 millimeters thick. And they have to be that thin in order to get a high rate of heat transfer, right? And so when we're testing samples that are 6 millimeters thick or 3 millimeters thick, it's maybe we're writing the line of how our parameters can transfer over to what's really going on in the real world. So we have to take a good look at this thickness effect that we apparently see in some of our data. And finally, this is just pure hedging of bets here. In the interest of hedging against a future nuclear-related catastrophe, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would do well to require at least one representative study in impure helium that confirms the lack of synergistic effects between creep and Heat 800C. That is my conclusion. That's my presentation. And I want to take a couple minutes to acknowledge some people, because you all have been a part of my life. Leading up to this thing, I wish there were more people here. I should have invited more people. Oh well. And how do I want to do that? Kind of chronologically. Parents, you gave me life. You encouraged me to achieve higher education goals. So thank you for that. Well, I acknowledge my friend Sebastian, who incidentally carried the food. And if all of you are all hungry, get up and serve yourself some food. They're good. It's good. Thank my friend Sebastian. Without you, I probably wouldn't even be in graduate school, and that's a long story in and of itself. But we'll just leave it there. Thanks, man. Anastasia, I want to acknowledge you for putting up with me while I've been earning not as much money as I could. And so that's something. The best days of our relationship are precious. I'm looking forward to it. And then to the people, the professors. Dr. Bay, when I got into graduate school, I wanted to work with you. And the funding wasn't there, the project wasn't there, it just didn't line up at the time. And you selflessly turned me over to Jay and said, he needs somebody filled, and recommended me. Totally changed the whole trajectory of my life, and I thank you for that. And I thank you for all the guidance that you've given me when I dropped by your office and just chatted.
I'm happy I could have failed to provide the resources.
Well, thank you for that. And to Dr. Tucker, in the past year, since you've been my co-advisor and welcoming me into your research group, it's been super fun, and a lot of resources have been available to me there, and you've kept me on task and on point as I try to finish this thing, setting goals. And then Jay, if I can see your face, take it off of screen saver. Jay, to you, just biggest thanks for the mentorship and the guidance throughout this whole thing, because it's been great, it's been fun, and I'm glad to be at the end of it. So with that, if anybody has any questions after looking at my references for this presentation, I would love to hear them.
We'll open it up for questions from the general audience. Who
first? Ian, please.
Sure. I think it's like starting slide 28, but there's a number of images there. I was wondering, how do you correlate the delta K to position on the image and like line up the photos and stuff? How do you do that?
Great question. I mean, the crack length is all off of electric potential drop. So we've got a big, every one of our samples has an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of voltage measurements that then turn into crack length. And then if you translate that crack length, given the load that we know we're applying, it's the same load, it's a constant amplitude test. But given the load that we know we're applying, we look at the crack length and we say, well, if this was the start of the test at it's 13 millimeters into the sample, and the voltage is telling us that 8 megapascal root meters happened a millimeter later, then we just use a scale. All these images, although you probably can't see it, do have scales. We just measure over, and I'll grant you that a lot of my placements are fairly approximate, but it tells the story. Thank you.
One other question at the end. What would you say the differences would be if you used a helium or impure helium atmosphere as compared to your in air? What would the difference be?
That is the question.
Yeah.
And my assumption is that the crack growth rates, that when you remove this protective oxide layer that's behind this sharp crack tip that has no oxygen on it, When you remove that in impure helium, the assumption that I want to make, and that some calculation can be done to support, hopefully, and this is some work needs to be done for this paper to be published about oxygen. The assumption is that the diffusion of oxygen through that protective oxide layer in air is more or at least equal to the oxygen in an impure helium environment. So that's the assumption we want to make, so that the damage that we're measuring in air is at least as bad as the damage that's going to be. We want these measurements to be conservative for that application. Does that make sense? So we can't say a lot because there's only a couple of data points from Benz and Wright about impure helium, and because of the way they did their tests, trying to do multiple hold times on the same sample, it's hard to say what those results actually mean. Anybody else? Garrett.
Interesting presentation. Have you thought about the ethical implications of studying crack propagation in Corval at Oregon State University?
The ethical implications of studying crack propagation, a good question, a serious question, and that's why I'm doing this presentation, because raising awareness of crack propagation here in the inner city is very important. Thank you for that, Garrett. Anybody else? Michelle.
How did you deal with the noise in the signal for the crackling?
Big acknowledgement, and why didn't I acknowledge you? It's because I didn't even know that you would be here. I'm sorry. Everybody, Michelle Jennings made this project happen. Her years that she spent on her master's program got the experimental setup to the point where I could pick it up and actually get usable data. And it was still very noisy, and to that end, Halsey rigged up a serial connection from a nanovoltmeter that was a lot more stable. So it was the signal going into the Instron attenuator, or whatever you call it, that was really noisy, and he circumvented that, so big props to Halsey for figuring that out, because elsewise, none of this, it wouldn't make any sense, it would be all over the board. So, and then Brendan, did you have one?
Yeah, I was going to follow up with a question about the oxide. What, you said there was like 9 elements or something in this alloy. What, do you have any idea what is creating the oxide?
Yes, it's chromium, and that's the design of the alloy, is that it has a high chromium content so that it forms a chromium oxide, like Cr2O3. So if you do a point scan with your EDS system, electron dispersion spectroscopy, you can get the stoichiometry of Cr2O3, and you're fairly certain that that's what's forming, that's what forms in all the tests that everybody does on this stuff in air. So that's definitely what it is. Thomas?
So if you've got impartial helium on the loop in the heat exchanger, what are they, or sorry, impure helium? Are they having impure helium on the other side of the loop as well?
That's a good question.
Because otherwise you're going to have some corrosion problems potentially?
It's a really good question. It could be steam or it could be helium, and the hope is that this material is robust enough to withstand anything. But yeah, we don't really know the full design because it's still 2 decades away. You know, it's like, when is this going to happen? Maybe never. But I tried to help make it happen. We'll see. Anybody else?
Related question to that, if there's another substance, and you probably don't know, I don't know, if has there been research done on if there's a pressure differential between the two sides, like the hot versus cold? Does that factor, obviously I think it would factor into this material failing. Has there been research done, or do you know?
Pressure differential on inside the tube versus in the shell of the heat exchanger? I would think that they're going to run it at generally the same pressure, and it's designed for 7 megapascals, which actually isn't that much in the scheme of, it's hard to get the feel for some of these numbers, but that's not actually a huge amount of pressure. Like what are the supercritical CO2 runs at 20 megapascals, so
That's really high.
yeah, that's super high pressure. 7 megapascals, not so high, but I don't think that's so much of an issue. And Richard?
It might be a stupid question. Why do you choose 617?
Why did we choose Alloy 617? Because it's 40 years old, 50 years old, and it's got tons of momentum behind it. That's the only reason.
Have you
It's
considered
because there's so
other?
much data behind it that it's the closest to being qualified. It had a code case almost qualify in the 90s, or at least it got brought to as a draft. And then they're like, no, this creep problem is a serious problem. We can't qualify it. We've got to rewrite our nuclear code. That's where our nuclear code is at right now, is that we've got to rewrite all the rules so that we can actually build new stuff. That's what's holding us back. And so this is part of the puzzle, is using Alloy 617 and acquiring even more data on it to make doubly sure that it's safe.
Okay, question.
Or Brian, yes.
So can you show that first plot where you've got the crack rate versus delta K way back in the beginning? Yeah, just those plots. So I know that on these log scales, I just see straight lines, and you keep talking about breakaway threshold levels. So is there a way that those are quantified or mathematically extracted from the?
I mean, you can.
I'm having trouble seeing it.
If you draw a line, a straight line on each one of these, I mean, you can see where the power law leads, and this one leads to much higher growth rates.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was some way that's.
So it would be, I guess, power law exponents, but I'm not sure why we.
I just mean, how would you decide what the breakaway level is, other than just looking at all those dots? Is there some way of extracting that?
Other than that, that's a good question. That's a damn good question. I've thought about that. And the thing is, it's answered in the force line displacement rate, I think, to some extent. It's like, where is the threshold? It's the force line displacement. When that starts to break away, you know. You know that it's time dependent. Because it's an inherently time dependent parameter. So that's my answer.
Okay.
And Yifan.
The same figure as well.
Huh?
For you see there's two kinds of sloping in here. The 5 hertz, the first part of the 5 hertz dots, you have a slope goes to the green ones and
Yeah, it's like
ones. And the latter part of the purple dots actually has a closer slope to the 0.33 hertz slope. That leads me to think about, could there be two kinds of mechanism for the fracturing, or
On the 0.05 hertz versus the 5 hertz?
yeah.
Or the two, in which different frequencies? I think I get where you're going.
5 hertz, there might be two kind of mechanisms leading the.
Right, okay, right, yeah. So the thing is, the roughness that we see on the fracture surfaces tell a story about a time-dependent mechanism that really wants to happen, but the crack is growing so fast that it can't happen. Okay? So that the crack is growing through the creep zone, the plastic zone, they're getting bigger as the sample gets broken more. And that's why we see there's less roughness at the end. And what does the roughness mean? The roughness is that branching behavior that we saw in the profile. That's what causes the roughness. So that the mechanism change is visible on the fracture surfaces of the higher frequencies, but it doesn't translate fully to a higher crack growth rate because it's not allowed to happen. The crack is growing too fast. Anything else?
Any more questions? All right, let's give Dylan another round of applause. We'll take a 5-minute break while the general audience clears out. Feel free to take a snack on your way, and if anyone needs a bio break.